My fiancé admitted at our rehearsal dinner in front of 200 guests that he proposed because his ex-wife bet him $100,000 he couldn't trick someone desperate into marriage. Blake Sutherland stood up during the toasts with his champagne glass raised, and his ex-wife Sloane appeared at the ballroom entrance holding her phone up like she was recording. My name is Autumn Graves, and I was sitting at the head table in my rehearsal dress watching my fiancé's face shift from charming to cold in the space of a heartbeat. Blake looked directly at me and said, "I need to confess something before we go through with this tomorrow. Sloane bet me $100,000 8 months ago that I couldn't convince someone desperate to marry me within 6 months of our divorce. She said I was so insufferable that nobody would choose me unless they were pathetic and running out of options." He gestured toward me with his glass, and I felt my entire body go numb. Autumn was perfect for the bet because she's 38 years old, never been married, no kids, and her social media was full of posts about wanting a family. I knew she'd say yes fast because her biological clock was screaming and she didn't have other prospects. The bet was simple. If I could get her to the altar, Sloane would pay me $100,000. If I failed, I'd pay her the same amount. The ballroom went completely silent, and I could hear my champagne glass slip from my shaking hands and shatter on the marble floor. My best friend Haven launched out of her seat shouting, "What the hell is wrong with you?" while my mother started crying somewhere behind me. Sloane walked into the ballroom with a satisfied smile and said, "I have the signed contract right here and 8 months of text messages where Blake mocked Autumn and strategized about maintaining the deception." Sloane pulled out her phone and started reading messages aloud in front of 200 guests who were now standing and shouting. Here's one from the day Blake proposed. "Autumn actually cried when I got down on one knee. She believes this is real. This is almost too easy." And here's another from 3 weeks ago. "Sometimes I feel guilty about what I'm doing to Autumn, then I remember the $100,000 and the fact that she'd probably never find anyone else anyway." And one more from yesterday. "Rehearsal dinner tomorrow. One more day of pretending and then I collect my money after the wedding." My sister Delaney threw her entire glass of wine in Blake's face and screamed that he was a monster. Blake's mother stood up and tried to say this was all a misunderstanding, but Blake cut her off and said, "Mom knew about the bet from the beginning. She thought it was hilarious and helped me maintain the act at family gatherings." My father, who rarely showed anger, stood up and told Blake to get out before he did something he'd regret. Blake shrugged and said, "I'm leaving anyway. The wedding is obviously off, which means I don't get paid. This whole thing was a waste of my time." He walked toward the exit while 200 guests screamed at him, and his mother followed crying about how this wasn't what it looked like. Sloane stayed behind holding her phone up, recording the chaos she'd orchestrated, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I told Blake he couldn't do it. I told him nobody was desperate enough to fall for his act. I was wrong about that, clearly." I don't remember how I got from the ballroom to the country club library, but Haven found me there sitting on the floor with my phone in my hands staring at nothing. She kneeled beside me and said, "Autumn, we need to call someone. We need to call a lawyer right now." Her voice sounded distant and distorted, but I watched her dial a number and put her phone on speaker. A man's voice answered saying, "This is Dominic Fletcher. Haven, what's the emergency?" Haven explained what had just happened at my rehearsal dinner, her voice shaking with rage as she described Blake's confession and Sloane's involvement. Dominic was quiet for a long moment before saying, "This is criminal fraud if Blake induced Autumn to make financial commitments or alter her life circumstances based on false pretenses with the intent to profit. It's also potentially actionable as intentional infliction of emotional distress. Haven, I need you to get copies of that contract and those text messages immediately. Tell everyone who recorded videos of the confession to send them to you. Don't let Sloane or Blake leave the venue until police arrive." Haven asked if we should call the police now, and Dominic said, "Absolutely. This is fraud, possibly conspiracy to commit fraud if Blake's mother was involved. Call 911 and report it. I'm contacting the district attorney's office right now because this case is going to be big." I found my voice finally and asked Dominic if any of this was real, if Blake had actually done this to me. Dominic's response was gentle but firm. "Autumn, based on what Haven just described, your fiancé engaged in a systematic campaign of fraud and emotional abuse for financial gain. You're a victim of a crime, not a failed relationship." Within 20 minutes, police arrived at the country club and took statements from me, Haven, my family, and multiple guests who'd witnessed Blake's confession. Officer Layla Washington was the lead investigator, and she recorded my statement in the library while Haven sat beside me holding my hand. I explained how Blake and I had met 9 months ago at a networking event for financial professionals, how he'd pursued me aggressively with flowers and romantic gestures, how he'd proposed after just 4 months of dating, how he'd been perfect and attentive and said all the right things about wanting marriage and family. Officer Washington asked if I'd made any financial commitments based on Blake's proposal, and I told her I'd spent $65,000 on wedding expenses, turned down a job opportunity in Boston because Blake wanted to stay in Chicago, and signed a lease on a larger apartment that we were supposed to move into after the wedding. She wrote everything down and said, "That establishes clear financial harm based on fraudulent inducement. Did Blake ever mention the bet or give any indication his intentions weren't genuine?" I said no, never, that he'd been consistently loving and committed until literally tonight. Officer Washington asked if I'd met Sloan before, and I said Blake had mentioned his ex-wife occasionally, always describing her as vindictive and jealous, never indicating they were in contact. The officer made notes and said, "We're going to need copies of that contract and those text messages." Multiple guests recorded Blake's confession on their phones, so we have evidence of his admission. Sloan's public reading of the text messages is also documented. This is actually a very strong case because the perpetrators essentially provided all the evidence themselves. Haven had been texting furiously during my police interview, and she told Officer Washington that 3 guests had already sent her videos of Blake's confession and Sloan's text message readings. Haven pulled them up on her phone, and we watched Blake admit to the bet in his own words, watched Sloan read messages mocking me, watched my family's reactions. The videos had already been posted to social media by guests, and Haven showed me her own Instagram where the rehearsal dinner confession was being shared and commented on by hundreds of people. "This is going viral," Haven said. "Blake's confession has been viewed over 100,000 times in the last 30 minutes. People are calling him a sociopath and a predator." Officer Washington said that social media attention could complicate the investigation, but also created a permanent public record of Blake's admission. She asked if I wanted to press charges, and I said yes without hesitation. I wanted Blake and Sloan to face every possible consequence for what they'd done to me. Officer Washington explained that the district attorney would review the case and determine specific charges, but based on the evidence, Blake and potentially Sloan could face fraud charges, conspiracy charges, and I could pursue civil damages for emotional distress. She gave me her card and told me to contact her directly if Blake or Sloan tried to reach out to me. As Officer Washington left to interview other witnesses, Haven showed me her phone again, where the videos had now been viewed over 1 million times and news outlets were starting to pick up the story. Dominic Fletcher arrived at the country club at midnight, 3 hours after Blake's confession had destroyed my life in front of 200 people. He was a black man in his early 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that made me feel slightly less like I was drowning. He sat down across from me in the library and said, "Autumn, I've been reviewing the videos Haven sent me, and I've spoken with the district attorney's office. They're treating this as a priority case because of the premeditated nature of the fraud and the public evidence. Blake's confession and Sloan's contract create an extremely strong foundation for criminal prosecution. I'm here to discuss the civil case, which runs parallel to criminal charges. You have grounds to sue both Blake and Sloan for fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and potentially punitive damages given the egregious nature of their conduct." He pulled out a legal pad and started taking notes as I walked him through the entire relationship with Blake. How we'd met, how he'd pursued me, how he'd talked about wanting marriage and children, how he'd integrated himself into my family and friend group, how he'd been supportive during my mother's recent health scare. Dominic asked specific questions about financial commitments I'd made based on Blake's false promises, and I listed the wedding expenses, the apartment lease, the declined job opportunity, and the fact that I'd been planning to start fertility treatments after the wedding because Blake had been enthusiastic about having children soon. "That last part is significant," Dominic said. "Blake's fraud directly impacted your reproductive timeline, which at 38 is a crucial factor. That's calculable harm beyond just emotional distress." Dominic explained that he wanted to file a civil lawsuit seeking $2 million in damages, $500,000 in compensatory damages for financial losses, emotional trauma, and reproductive harm, and $1.5 million in punitive damages to punish Blake and Sloan for particularly malicious conduct. The punitive amount was justified by the premeditated nature of the fraud, the systematic emotional abuse documented in Blake's text messages, and the public humiliation they'd inflicted by revealing the bet at the rehearsal dinner instead of privately. "They wanted maximum humiliation," Dominic said. "Sloan could have exposed Blake privately or before the rehearsal dinner, but she chose the most public, devastating moment. That speaks to intentional cruelty beyond just the fraud itself." He asked if I'd be willing to undergo psychological evaluation to document the emotional impact, and I agreed. Dominic said he'd file the lawsuit within 48 hours and that Blake and Sloan would be served simultaneously. He warned me that Blake would likely hire an aggressive attorney who would try to claim the bet was a joke or that I'd known about it all along. "They'll try to victim blame and suggest you were so desperate that you would have accepted Blake knowing the truth," Dominic explained. "That's a standard defense strategy in fraud cases, but we have text messages where Blake explicitly discussed maintaining deception and mocked you for believing him. That's not a joke, that's malicious fraud." Haven asked what would happen if Blake and Sloan tried to settle quickly to avoid publicity, and Dominic said that was likely, but we'd negotiate from a position of strength given the overwhelming evidence. I spent the night at Haven's apartment because I couldn't go back to the place I'd shared with Blake, and I couldn't face staying with my parents who were devastated and furious. Haven set me up in her guest room and sat with me while I scrolled through social media, watching my humiliation become a national news story. The videos of Blake's confession had been picked up by major news outlets with headlines like, "Groom admits wedding was $100K bet at rehearsal dinner," and "Cruel betting scheme exposed when ex-wife reveals truth to devastated bride." The comment sections were filled with people calling Blake a sociopath and expressing sympathy for me, but also with cruel speculation about whether I really had been desperate and whether I should have known something was wrong. One comment thread debated whether being 38 and unmarried meant I'd been too eager to believe Blake, and another discussed whether wanting children badly made me vulnerable to manipulation. Haven took my phone away and said, "Stop reading that garbage. People who've never been deceived by a skilled liar love to judge victims for not seeing through the deception. Blake spent 8 months studying you and crafting a perfect persona. You're not stupid or desperate for believing someone who told you he loved you." I asked Haven if she'd suspected anything was wrong during my relationship with Blake, and she admitted she'd thought the relationship moved fast, but Blake had seemed genuinely devoted. "He fooled everyone, Autumn. Your parents loved him. I liked him. Your coworkers thought he was great. Sociopaths are good at performing normalcy while planning cruelty." The district attorney's office called me at 8 a.m. the next morning, the day that should have been my wedding day. The prosecutor handling my case was a woman named Fiona Blackwell, who specialized in fraud and domestic abuse cases. She explained that after reviewing the evidence from the rehearsal dinner, they were charging Blake with 2 counts of criminal fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud. Sloan was being charged with conspiracy and extortion, given that she'd essentially blackmailed Blake into confessing publicly instead of allowing him to collect the bet money. "The contract between Blake and Sloan is evidence of premeditation and financial motive," Fiona explained. "The text messages Blake sent to Sloan document systematic deception and emotional manipulation. Your financial losses and the documented impact on your life choices establish clear harm. This is one of the strongest fraud cases I've seen because the defendants documented everything themselves and then confessed publicly." She asked if I'd be willing to testify in criminal proceedings, and I said absolutely. Fiona warned me that Blake's attorney would likely try to discredit me by suggesting I'd been complicit in the fraud, or that I'd known about the bet, but the text messages would refute that defense. "Blake's own words describe you as believing the relationship was genuine and being emotionally invested in the wedding. That's not consistent with someone who knew about a bet." Fiona said arraignment would happen within 72 hours and she'd keep me updated. As we ended the call, she added, "Autumn, I want you to know that what Blake and Sloan did to you goes beyond typical relationship fraud. They targeted you specifically because of your age and life circumstances. That's predatory behavior, and we're going to prosecute accordingly." Dominic filed the civil lawsuit 36 hours after the rehearsal dinner, seeking $2 million in damages from both Blake and Sloan. The lawsuit detailed every aspect of Blake's fraud: the systematic deception over 8 months, the financial commitments I'd made based on false promises, the emotional manipulation documented in text messages, the public humiliation at the rehearsal dinner, and the reproductive harm given my age and the time lost to Blake's scheme. The lawsuit also included claims against Blake's mother, Diane Sutherland, for her role in maintaining the fraud. According to Blake's own admission, Diane had known about the bet and participated in family gatherings while knowing Blake was deceiving me. That made her potentially liable as an accessory to fraud. Dominic explained that including Diane would put pressure on Blake's entire family and might force a quicker settlement. "Family members often convince defendants to settle when their own reputations and finances are at risk," he said. The lawsuit was filed publicly, which meant media outlets immediately covered it, and the $2 million figure generated headlines. Blake was served with a civil complaint the same day he was arraigned on criminal charges, and according to Dominic's contact at the courthouse, Blake had looked shocked by the amount of the civil damages. His attorney, a defense lawyer named Garrett Finley who specialized in white-collar crime, immediately filed a motion to dismiss the civil case, arguing that Blake's confession at the rehearsal dinner had been made under duress from Sloan and didn't constitute admission of fraud. Garrett Finley's defense strategy became clear when he held a press conference 3 days after Blake's arraignment. Standing outside the courthouse with Blake beside him looking contrite and exhausted, Finley claimed that the entire bet had been Sloan's idea as a twisted revenge scheme against her ex-husband. "Blake Sutherland genuinely loved Autumn Graves and wanted to marry her," Finley said to reporters. "His ex-wife Sloan manipulated him into participating in a bet by threatening to destroy his reputation and his relationship with Autumn through false accusations. Blake confessed at the rehearsal dinner because Sloan was blackmailing him, not because the relationship was fraudulent. The text messages the prosecution is relying on were written under coercion, as Blake tried to appease his unstable ex-wife. Blake's real crime was trying to protect Autumn from Sloan's vindictiveness by keeping her in the dark about the threats he was facing." The narrative was sophisticated and almost plausible if you didn't read the actual text messages where Blake expressed genuine contempt for me and calculated strategies for maintaining deception. Dominic and Fiona both called me after Finley's press conference to warn me that this defense strategy would involve attacking my credibility and suggesting I was too eager to believe Blake because of desperation. "They're going to paint you as someone so desperate for marriage that you ignored red flags and now you're seeking revenge through false accusations," Dominic explained. "We need to be prepared for that, and we need evidence that contradicts it." Haven had been working as my unofficial investigator since the rehearsal dinner disaster, and she'd discovered something crucial while going through old social media posts. Blake and Sloan hadn't just stayed in contact after their divorce, they'd been coordinating the bet scheme through multiple platforms to avoid detection. Haven found Instagram messages between Blake and Sloan discussing the bet in detail, including conversations about target selection where they'd discussed several potential desperate women before settling on me. The messages showed Sloan had helped Blake research my background, my job, my family, and my social media presence to build his persona as the perfect partner for me. "Look at this message from Sloan to Blake 3 weeks before you met him," Haven said, showing me her phone. She wrote, "The networking event on the 15th will have several women in their late 30s working in finance. That's your target demographic. Look for someone successful but anxious about being single. Someone whose Instagram shows she's thinking about marriage and kids. Someone isolated enough that family intervention won't derail the plan." I read through dozens of messages where Sloan and Blake had strategized about how to approach me, what to say on our first date, how to escalate the relationship quickly, when to propose. They'd planned everything with clinical precision, treating my manipulation as a project with timelines and benchmarks. Haven had screenshot everything and sent it to both Dominic and Fiona. "This destroys Finley's defense that Blake was coerced by Sloan," Haven said. "These messages show active collaboration and Blake's enthusiastic participation in planning the fraud." The Instagram messages between Blake and Sloan became the prosecution's key evidence, completely undermining Garrett Finley's coercion defense. Fiona Blackwell filed an amended complaint adding charges of conspiracy and premeditated fraud based on the documented planning conversations. At the preliminary hearing, Fiona presented the messages chronologically, showing the jury exactly how Blake and Sloan had identified me as a target, researched my vulnerabilities, and executed an 8-month deception campaign. One message thread was particularly damning. Sloan had written to Blake after their third date with me, "She's already falling for you. She told her best friend that she thinks you might be the one. This is going exactly as planned. Keep doing the romantic gestures and talking about future family plans. She'll be engaged within 4 months." Blake had responded, "It's almost too easy. Autumn is smart about work stuff but completely naive about men. She believes everything I say because she wants it to be true so badly. I'll propose after 4 months like you suggested. That gives us enough time to make the relationship seem organic but maintains urgency so she doesn't overthink things." The jury's reaction to these messages was visible shock and disgust. Finley tried to object, claiming the messages were taken out of context, but the context was explicit and documented over hundreds of exchanges. The judge denied the motion to dismiss and ruled that the case would proceed to trial. Blake's mother, Diane, hired her own attorney after being named in the civil lawsuit, and her attorney's defense strategy was to claim Diane had thought the bet was a joke and hadn't realized Blake was actually defrauding me. Mrs. Sutherland believed her son genuinely cared for Autumn and that the bet with Sloan was merely a friendly wager that didn't affect the authenticity of the relationship, her attorney stated in a court filing. But Haven had found evidence contradicting that claim too. Several guests from family gatherings I'd attended with Blake had come forward after seeing the news coverage, and they reported conversations where Diane had made comments suggesting she knew I was being deceived. One guest, a cousin of Blake's named Trevor Sutherland, provided a sworn statement describing a conversation at Thanksgiving where Diane had said to Blake in front of family members, "I can't believe Autumn has no idea what's really happening. You're a better actor than I thought." When Blake had laughed and said, "It's a gift," Diane had responded, "Just make sure you get your money before she figures it out." Trevor said he'd assumed at the time that it was a joke about Blake marrying for money, but in retrospect, it was clearly acknowledgement of the fraud. Dominic used Trevor's statement to amend the civil complaint against Diane, adding specific allegations of knowing participation in Blake's fraud and active concealment of the truth from me. Diane's attorney tried to discredit Trevor by suggesting he had ulterior motives for testifying against family, but Trevor provided text messages where he'd expressed concern to other family members about Blake's relationship with me and been told by Diane to mind his own business. The criminal trial began 4 months after the rehearsal dinner confession, and I testified on the second day. Fiona Blackwell walked me through the entire relationship with Blake, asking me to describe how we'd met, how he'd pursued me, what he'd said about wanting marriage and family, how he'd integrated into my life. I described the proposal in detail. Blake had taken me to the restaurant where we'd had our first date and proposed in front of the staff and other diners, making a speech about how he'd known from that first evening that I was the person he wanted to spend his life with. I'd cried and said yes immediately, overwhelmed by what I'd thought was genuine emotion. Fiona asked if I'd had any suspicion that Blake wasn't sincere, and I said no, never, that he'd been consistently loving and attentive, had met my family and friends, had discussed specific plans for our future, including children and a house we'd planned to buy. She asked about the financial commitments I'd made based on Blake's promises, and I detailed the $65,000 in wedding expenses, the apartment lease, the declined job opportunity. Then Fiona showed me the text messages Blake had sent to Sloan during our relationship, messages mocking me and discussing strategies for maintaining the deception. "Did you know about these messages while you were engaged to Blake?" Fiona asked. I said no, that I'd believed Blake when he said he wasn't in contact with his ex-wife, that discovering these messages after the rehearsal dinner had been devastating proof that everything I'd experienced as love had been performance. Garrett Finley's cross-examination was aggressive and designed to suggest I'd been willfully blind to evidence that Blake was deceiving me. He asked why I'd agreed to marry someone after only 4 months of dating, suggesting that was unusually fast. I explained that while the timeline was accelerated, Blake had been consistent and committed in ways that made the relationship feel stable, and that many couples get engaged within a year. Finley asked if I'd been feeling pressure about my age and desire for children, trying to establish that I'd been desperate in Blake's words. I acknowledged that wanting to have children before 40 had been a factor in my life planning, but that wasn't desperation. It was normal family planning. Finley asked if I'd ignored warning signs that Blake might have ulterior motives, and I said there had been no warning signs because Blake had been skilled at deception. Fiona objected when Finley asked whether I'd thrown myself at Blake early in the relationship, and the judge sustained the objection, warning Finley about victim blaming. But the damage was done in terms of planting seeds of doubt about whether I'd been complicit in my own deception. Finley's closing argument emphasized that theme. Autumn Graves wanted to be married so badly that she convinced herself Blake Sutherland was perfect, ignored evidence that the relationship was moving too fast, and now that it's ended badly, she's using the criminal justice system to seek revenge and financial compensation. The real victim here is Blake Sutherland, who made a stupid bet with his vindictive ex-wife but genuinely cared for Autumn, and is now facing criminal charges for what amounts to a failed relationship. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both Blake and Sloan. Blake was convicted of 2 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy. Sloan was convicted of conspiracy and extortion. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later, and Fiona told me that Blake faced up to 8 years in prison and Sloan faced up to 6 years. The guilty verdicts made national news, and the videos of Blake's rehearsal dinner confession resurfaced with new commentary about justice and accountability for emotional fraud. Social media responses were mixed. Some people celebrated the convictions as recognition that psychological manipulation could be criminal. Others argued that criminalizing bad relationship behavior was government overreach. But the evidence had been overwhelming, the text messages explicitly documenting premeditated fraud for financial gain. At sentencing, I gave a victim impact statement describing how Blake's fraud had affected every aspect of my life. Blake Sutherland targeted me specifically because he believed I was desperate and vulnerable, I said to the court. He studied my social media, identified my desire for family, and crafted a persona designed to exploit those hopes. He spent 8 months performing love while privately mocking me and planning to abandon me after collecting money from his ex-wife. The emotional harm from this betrayal has affected my ability to trust, my professional life, my relationships with family and friends, and my reproductive timeline. Blake didn't just break my heart, he stole 8 months of my life at a time when I didn't have months to waste. That's calculated cruelty for profit, and it deserves serious consequences. The judge sentenced Blake to 5 years in prison and Sloan to 3 years, with both required to pay restitution to cover my wedding expenses and other financial losses. The judge's statement was scathing. The defendants engaged in premeditated psychological manipulation for financial gain, targeting the victim based on age and life circumstances they perceived as vulnerabilities. They documented their fraud extensively, demonstrating calculated cruelty and complete lack of remorse until caught. This case represents a form of intimate partner abuse that rarely results in criminal prosecution, but the evidence here was overwhelming. Blake Sutherland's fraud was not a failed relationship or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate campaign of deception executed for money. Sloan Sutherland's participation in orchestrating and facilitating that fraud makes her equally culpable. The sentences reflect the serious nature of their crimes and the significant harm inflicted on the victim. Blake's mother, Diane, avoided criminal charges but settled the civil case against her for $150,000, publicly apologizing and acknowledging she'd known about the bet and failed to protect me. Blake and Sloan both appealed their convictions, arguing that fraud charges shouldn't apply to relationship deception. But the appeals court upheld the verdicts, ruling that inducing someone to make substantial financial and life commitments through systematic lies for profit constitutes criminal fraud regardless of the intimate relationship context. The civil case against Blake and Sloan proceeded separately and went to trial 8 months after the criminal convictions. Dominic presented evidence of the fraud, the financial losses, and extensive expert testimony about the psychological impact of betrayal trauma. A reproductive endocrinologist testified about how 8 months of lost time affected my fertility prospects at age 38, calculating that the delay reduced my chances of successful pregnancy by approximately 15%. A psychologist testified about the symptoms of PTSD I'd developed after the rehearsal dinner revelation, including anxiety, trust issues, and difficulties in subsequent relationships. Financial experts calculated damages beyond just the wedding expenses, including the value of the declined job opportunity and the cost of the apartment lease I'd signed based on Blake's false promises. Garrett Finley's defense in the civil case was that criminal convictions didn't automatically establish civil liability, and that the damages I was seeking were excessive given that I'd only been in a relationship with Blake for 8 months. But the jury wasn't sympathetic to that argument after seeing the text messages where Blake had explicitly discussed causing me emotional harm and collecting money for doing so. The civil jury deliberated for 3 hours before awarding me $1.8 million in total damages, $300,000 in compensatory damages, and $1.5 million in punitive damages split between Blake and Sloan. The punitive damages were designed to punish the particularly egregious nature of their conduct and deter similar behavior. Dominic called it one of the largest civil awards for relationship fraud in state history. Blake and Sloan were both in prison when the civil verdict came down, which meant collecting the damages would require seizing their assets and establishing payment plans from their future earnings. Blake had been working as a financial consultant before his arrest, and had assets totaling approximately $400,000, including savings, investments, and a condo he owned. Those assets were seized to partially satisfy the civil judgment. Sloan owned a successful marketing firm and had assets totaling approximately $600,000. Her business was sold to satisfy her portion of the judgment, and her personal assets were liquidated. Blake's mother Diane's settlement of $150,000 brought my total recovery to $1.15 million of the $1.8 million awarded, with the remainder to be collected through garnishment of Blake and Sloan's future earnings after their release from prison. The financial recovery was significant, but it couldn't undo the psychological damage or give me back the 8 months I'd lost to Blake's fraud. I used part of the settlement to fund therapy, taking a leave of absence from my job to focus on recovery and processing the trauma. My therapist, Dr. Neena Patel, specialized in betrayal trauma and helped me understand that what Blake had done wasn't about my supposed desperation or any failure on my part to detect deception. Blake was a skilled manipulator who studied you and crafted a perfect performance, Dr. Patel explained. Wanting partnership and family at 38 isn't desperation, it's normal human desire. Blake weaponized that desire, which says everything about his character and nothing about yours. The media attention around my case led to dozens of other people reaching out with similar stories of relationship fraud, though few had the kind of documented evidence that had made my case prosecutable. A woman named Iris Kwan contacted me through social media to share that she'd been engaged to someone who'd maintained an entire secret life, including another fiancé in a different city, only revealing the truth when confronted by the other woman at what was supposed to be their wedding venue. Another woman, Bethany Vance, described being in a 5-year relationship with someone who'd been secretly married the entire time and had only been with her as part of an elaborate financial scheme to access her family's money. These stories made me realize that while my case had received unusual attention due to Blake's public confession and the criminal convictions, relationship fraud was far more common than people acknowledged. Most cases never resulted in legal action because evidence was hard to gather, and prosecutors rarely treated relationship deception as criminal fraud. I started speaking publicly about my experience, doing interviews with news outlets and podcasts about the need for better legal recognition of intimate partner fraud, and more resources for people recovering from systematic romantic deception. The case had made me inadvertently prominent in discussions about relationship abuse and legal accountability, and I decided to use that platform to advocate for other victims. 2 years after the rehearsal dinner disaster, I was invited to testify before a state legislative committee considering a bill that would create specific civil remedies for relationship fraud. The proposed legislation would make it easier for victims to sue for damages without having to prove the high bar of criminal fraud, recognizing that inducing someone into a relationship through systematic lies with intent to cause harm should be actionable even without criminal prosecution. I testified about my experience with Blake, describing the emotional and financial impact of his fraud, and explaining how the criminal and civil cases had required overwhelming evidence that most victims wouldn't have. Blake and Sloan essentially provided all the evidence needed to prosecute them by documenting their fraud extensively and confessing publicly, I told the committee. Most people who experience relationship fraud don't have text messages or signed contracts or video confessions. They just have the experience of being systematically deceived by someone they trusted. The law should recognize that harm and provide remedies even without criminal-level proof. The legislation passed 6 months later, creating a new cause of action for intimate partner fraud with lower evidentiary requirements than criminal fraud charges and allowing for compensatory damages, attorney fees, and in extreme cases, punitive damages. The law was nicknamed Autumn's Law by advocacy groups, though I'd never sought that recognition and felt uncomfortable having my trauma turned into legislative branding. I met someone new 3 years after Blake's confession destroyed my life in front of 200 people. His name was Daniel Vaughn, and we met through mutual friends at a book club, not through dating apps or professional networking events. I was terrified of being deceived again, hypervigilant about inconsistencies or red flags, constantly waiting for Daniel to reveal that this was another performance. But Daniel was patient with my trust issues and understood where they came from because I'd been transparent about my history from our first date. "I know you've been through hell," he said during one of our early conversations. "I'm not asking you to trust me immediately. I'm just asking for the chance to show you through consistent actions over time that I'm genuine. No pressure, no timeline, just honesty and patience." We dated slowly for 2 years before getting engaged, and Daniel proposed privately without elaborate performance, just the two of us hiking in the mountains where nobody could film or witness or turn it into spectacle. He said, "I love you exactly as you are, Autumn. Not because of your age or your desire for family or any other factor Blake tried to exploit. I love you because of who you are as a person, and I want to build a life with you based on truth and mutual respect." I said yes, knowing this was genuine because I'd had 2 years to observe Daniel's character, to see how he treated people when he thought nobody was watching, to verify that his words matched his actions consistently over time. Daniel and I married in a small ceremony with 30 people who genuinely cared about us. No rehearsal dinner because I couldn't handle the trauma associations. And we built a life together based on honesty instead of deception. Blake served his full 5-year sentence and was released to strict probation conditions, including staying away from me and my family. Sloan served 3 years and moved to a different state after release, reportedly working in retail since her marketing firm had been sold to satisfy the civil judgment. Neither of them attempted to contact me, and I had no interest in any form of reconciliation or closure with people who'd treated my life as a game. I'm 43 now with a husband who chose me without bets or conditions, and we have a daughter born when I was 40 through IVF funded partially by the settlement money from my case against Blake and Sloan. Every time I look at my daughter, I think about how Blake tried to steal my chance at family through fraud and failed completely. Justice wasn't just the prison sentences or the financial damages or the legislation that came from my case. Justice was building a life filled with genuine love and partnership despite Blake's attempts to convince me I was too desperate to deserve either. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too, so subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.